So you've had an idea for a video game. You've spent a year coding 15 hours a day, you hired an art designer, you've licensed some music. Now all that's left is to release it and see it go viral. Easy. Well, it turns out that this is not your default difficulty setting. Every day, 40 new games are added to the world's biggest distribution platform, Steam. And unfortunately, most of them quickly fade into obscurity. So today I am playing support for my two raid party members who will give us an idea on the business and marketing skill trees developers need to spec into to turn a profit on their games. Paweł Miechowski, a writer and communications and brand partnership expert from 11-Bit Studios, joining us from Warsaw. And from Taipei, we have Iain Garner, the CEO of the video game publisher Neon Doctrine. Paweł, 40 new releases per day sounds like a lot, but one would assume that that is the result of there being more gamers and more sales being made on the platform. But from what we've discussed before, that doesn't seem to be the case. So how did we get to this massive imbalance of people making games and people receiving them?
Well, yes, like I mentioned before, the market is surely overcrowded, right? So we have Godot, we have Unity, we have Unreal Engine. So there's a very solid availability of game making tools accessible to practically anyone who can, skillfully use a computer. But there's something I call survivor bias. I mean, there's a ton of 1, 2, 3 man studios, like Iain mentioned before, willing to enter the market, and okay, they have tools, they have some know-how, they are looking at the successful titles and try to repeat the way the successful titles went through. And those games are unfortunately not so much creative. Out of those 40, 30 something are pretty much copies of some successful titles, maybe sometimes with a twist. So they are sadly destined to fail, and this is what happens, right? So plus those titles are competing with teams that are making games for 10, 15, 30 years, like in our case. So we have experience, we have a financial background, we have resources. We know how to market titles, which now seems to be very important part, because back in the days, sometimes a great game and a bit of luck was enough. It's not anymore. You really need to, the horizon of the market changed so much that you need to know how to reach creators on Twitch, on YouTube, how to communicate on TikTok, how to put all those communication bits within one coherent campaign. Also, I think the COVID era that led to this overcrowding meant also something else. I mean, we are not competing with each other. We are competing for players' time, because a player is not only playing games. A player is a person going out for a walk, playing with a child, going to cinema, watching Netflix, Disney Plus, and playing board games and cooking, favorite meal. So basically, we're having a economy of time in which we are competing with different forms of spending time to be, one of ours. I mean, we want to be successful in convincing people to spend part of the time on playing games. And this is where another layer of tough times or hardship kicks in. And on top of that, like I said, there are teams like Iain's or mine, where we've been doing what we're doing for years, and we are, this is, injustice, but I'd say privileged in a way, where we have financial background and know-how to prepare well with the launch of a title to the market. Yet I just add that I completely agree with Iain about the AAA industry, the problems. Those are successful who spend years on creating a brand. and a brand is something you wanna go for. Because if you look at Grand Theft Auto, or looking at a Polish example, Cyberpunk or The Witcher, you have very good, strong brands. Same with Assassin's Creed. Unless you water down a brand, it's safely easy or less risky. Maybe easy is not a good word, but less risky to put all those tens of millions of dollars into a game on the AAA market, because you have a brand. And Grand Theft Auto is such a brand. I mean, I can bet anything that their next game is gonna be crazy successful, because Rockstar is Rockstar. They know how to make games, and they promoted it in a very good way. And I'd say this same, on a smaller scale, that this same mechanism can be applied to other teams. But there's just too many AAA games, and when you compete with such big, strong brands, creating a new one would take enormous amount of resources. And I think the AAA publishers just don't want to take the risk, so hence the layoffs and so on. So I think the consolidation will also happen on the brand market in games. We're gonna see smaller amount of brands, but very strong ones.
Iain, speaking of smaller, what kind of mistakes, both in sort of developments and on the business side, do you see smaller developers that you work with make, people who come to you for help?
Yeah, I mean, I think the single biggest mistake is about time, right? I think it kind of is similar to what Paweł just said about the individual having like only so much time in the day to play games. People only have so much time in the day to make them as well. And what we often find with small development teams, especially on the indie side, is that they're often very young and very enthusiastic, and they kind of, so for example, they'll build a prototype in like 3 months, right? And they will work 18 hours a day, crunch like you wouldn't believe, eat nothing but ramen and drink nothing but Monster until the prototype is finished. And then they will extrapolate that out and say, okay, we can then finish this really ambitious game in 18 months with a budget of X amount of USD. And what I often see people failing to count in is that they can't. Like, you can't work that way for 2 years. You might be able to work that way for 3 months, but you can't work that way for 2 years. And you also can't expect people you employ to work that way. And that's where you end up with some toxicity that tends to come in when smaller studios expand, because often you have people who are expecting everyone to match their level of enthusiasm, but they don't, because it's a job for most people, right? A founder is always going to work more than an employee. It kind of just in the DNA, it's part of the deal, right? So that's, I think, the number one mistake I see from indie developers is, and then when they build their business on that, and they build their pitches on that, and they get funding based on that, and then suddenly they can't do it, it all starts to fall to pieces very, very quickly. And that's when bad decisions get made. That's when people start having, friction with their business partners, and can often lead to, negative consequences. Sometimes it's just that the team just totally burns out and the game never launches. I mean, if you want to see, just look at the graveyard that is Kickstarter. You can see so many games that got funded by small teams, and that ultimately you just realize that they just bit off more than they could chew. That brilliant prototype they made can't be scaled in the way that they thought it could. And that's something that honestly only experience can teach. And I think that's one of the big problems that we have as an industry at the moment, is that we're not giving people second chances. So we're having these like really powerful, talented developers who have got this creative spark. They're trying to create something amazing, but ultimately they don't succeed. But because they don't succeed that first time, that's kind of it. And I think in Taiwan, that's particularly prevalent because there is very little government support here.
Well, on that note, We asked On Takahashi, the director of Yukio Studios, which helps smaller developers show off their work around the world, about what one big success can do to a country's game industry and the role of government funding.
Personally, I think Poland does a very, very good example. I think, CD Projekt Red is like the most valuable company on their stock market. They've seen the success of The Witcher and stuff. So the Game from Poland booth is literally at every single event that you go to. And I think a lot of countries are starting to realize like, hey, video games does hire a lot of people. A lot of them are work from home, so they don't really require infrastructure in terms of, office buildings. And it employs a lot of kind of like young people in tech who don't necessarily want to go into like corporate tech. Yeah, it's a very creative venture as well. And in the case of say something like CD Projekt Red or something, one video game could literally put the country on the map. Government putting in a little bit of money to support it, and then the outcomes tenfold, 100-fold back. So I think a lot of governments are probably going to start more pushing into indies rather than supporting AAAs. AAAs have the money, right? So we'll probably see a lot more government-related pushes coming in.
You can watch the full version of that video feature on making games in Taiwan on our YouTube channel and the TaiwanPlus website. Paweł, Poland really seems to be taking off, as we heard, and well, as everyone really knows at this point. How much of that success was due to government funding? How instrumental was the Polish government in helping out?
Well, I know the industry, local one, well from within, and I'm in it for almost 30 years, actually, and I was making games before CD Projekt was making games. And a trivia here, one of the games we have made in the 90s was actually published by CD Projekt as the very first Polish video game with voiceovers that the guys recorded themselves. That's a trivia. And the game was called Agent, and it was 1996, if I recall correctly.
I don't want to age myself, but I do remember it vividly. I played it.
Yeah. So yeah, I was one of the guys working on it, although I was a teenager back then. But my roots are quite early in the industry. Anyhow, the beginning of the industry is actually related more to the fact that we had a wild copyright, actually lack of copyrights. The piracy was legal until exactly 96 or 97. So the availability of games was wide for super cheap prices. Everybody who got Amiga or Commodore 64 or PC 486 or Pentiums, they got a lot of free games. So, and it was legal. You could go legally to shop and copy a game without any copyrights. And I used to do that as well. So that led, ironically, to the huge rise of the market, because when the copyright was changed on the legal side, then already there was a huge need from players to, play games. That's one thing. And the other is that led also to many people being simply interested in creation. So once the communism collapsed, we were already having first companies making games in the early 90s. So Techland, the creators of Dying Light franchise, they started in the early 90s. 11-bit Studios is a kind of partially a child of Metropolis Software that I used to work for as well, which was one of the very first companies in Poland. So we have had a scene developed in the 90s without any actually governmental support. But at our universities, we have a very high level of programming faculties. So there was also a very easy way to find very skilled programmers, and a ton of them on the market. And on the underpaid market that Poland was back then, the costs of creation were incredibly small comparing to the, let's say, American ones. Once we found a publisher in the 90s, that was Monolith, an American company, and we had a producer coming to Warsaw from, I think it was from Los Angeles. He was shocked what was the average monthly pay for a programmer, a skilled programmer in Warsaw comparing to LA. So the costs of development were that small, but that helped to rise. So actually the first governmental support shows up, I say, around 15 years ago, 17 maybe. There was a program called Game In, and that was but a very big one, I must say, millions of Polish zlotys, hundreds of millions. And that program was targeted for R&D, so basically research and development. So teams were able to fund development of new engine tools, narrative tools, everything that helped. And CD Projekt was one of, if not the biggest beneficiary of that program. But please keep in mind, the scene grew before there was any support from the government. But now we do have also incredible tax relief program that once your game is successful, you can reinvest the money into further development, and you pay only 5% of income tax. We now have program by the Ministry of Culture that they are funding prototyping, which is very helpful as well, because when smaller teams can get funding from the government, they are more risky because they know they can. And of course, that means it's like funding in, Silicon Valley, sort of. So some prototypes will fail because they are risky, but some might be insanely successful because they took the risk. Like, no pain, no gain, in that saying. The bigger the risk, the bigger the win.
So Iain, how does that compare to kind of how Taiwanese government structures its support for video game developers? And are we seeing the same kind of like internal drive to grow that is supported by the government, or what is the situation here?
I haven't had a lot of success with understanding that side of things in Taiwan, if I'm honest. When I did kind of dip my toe in, I found that there was a pretty astronomical amount of paperwork to do and a pretty astronomical amount of legalese to deal with, which was, in my opinion, not the best use of our resources to do. So we've actually never really gone forward with any government funding or anything like that. We do know some developers that have managed to secure it, and this was a couple of years ago, so things may have changed. They did say it was really hard. It was really hard to get that funding. But what I have seen, which I was very surprised at, is that when games were kind of moderately successful, not necessarily like the biggest successes, but moderately successful, that there's not been a lot of like reach out. There's not been a lot of like desire to kind of figure out how to emulate or support that. And I think often what's missing is like incubation, right? Like Taiwan doesn't have a lot of long-standing studios. Most of the studios are very young. Even Red Candle is very, very young, exceptionally successful and exceptionally talented, but very young. And what that means is that there's not the same kind of legacy of knowledge that you have somewhere like Poland, right, where you've got people like Paweł that have been doing this since the early 90s. We don't really have that here, and that means that there is a gap of knowledge. And that gaps tend to be filled by like raw enthusiasm, which is really good. But you need more than raw enthusiasm to make a successful business. You need people to kind of show you how to structure your time, how to structure your books, how to pay your taxes, how to do all of that boring stuff. And I think that there's a pretty big gap here on that. And I think you can see that when you kind of look at kind of the indie scene in Taiwan at large. There's a huge amount of potential. There's a huge amount of talent, but it kind of needs to be sharpened.